talking because sometimes the first few words get eaten up by the Hangout.
Okay.
All right, cool. We are live. When last we welcomed Tracy Hurley into the Private Sanctuary, it was based on her role as a co-host of the Tome Show, a D&D podcast to talk about skill challenges in the now classic Private Sanctuary 189. Today we're inviting her on because, well, Tracy wears a lot of hats. I almost called you Sarah, actually, including she is a renowned blogger, the Sarah Dark Magic blog, and she's an advocate for equality in gaming. So, Tracy, first of all, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Second of all, is it okay if I accidentally call you Sarah, apparently, throughout this whole episode?
Yes, that's fine. I had gotten used to it when I first started between Twitter and the blog. When I went to conventions, people would call me Sarah.
That makes sense. I mean, my co-host on No Direction is Param. That's his alias, and that's all people know him as. And I've got the advantage of just using my regular name for the whole time. So I'm a little... I don't know what you're going through when people call you Sarah. So I'm glad to hear that you're cool with it.
Yeah, totally. Plus, it was my first character's name, so I got used to being called it anyway.
Perfect. So why don't you start by just reminding people what the Sarah Dark Magic blog is all about?
So it's my personal blog about whatever interests me about gaming or the geek space. A lot of times it does cover topics of inclusivity, especially gender. But I've also put on there, adventures or sample. I think I did some pre-gen characters once because the D&D Encounter series didn't have that many women in it. So I was like, here's some you could use. Also, when I do writing, I sometimes as a freelancer, I sometimes post about the writing I did on there. And way back, although I haven't updated it lately, we also had an adventure directory that people could search that was by level and system.
Cool. And just scrolling through your blog, it's true. It does seem like you cover a gamut of topics. So why do you think it is that, at least from my perception of you, a lot of people associate you with advocating equality?
So a lot of it has to do with the blog, and then also on G+ and Twitter, I bring up those issues a lot, and I share particularly what women in tech are doing to try to help the equality there, because that's where my day job is. I work as a systems engineer, so there are also questions about inclusivity in that field.
Well, then I hope you don't feel like I am pigeonholing you by bringing you on the podcast specifically to talk about an inclusive topic. And actually, I'm glad that you've been on the podcast once before, so that I don't feel like, oh, I'm bringing a girl in to talk about inclusivity, but my normal co-host is Kathy, so at least I get a pass there.
Yeah, no, it's great. And also, I mean, I've done a lot of freelancing, including for companies like Paizo, so I can draw from that stuff too.
Excellent. So we are talking about inclusivity today. It's been a hot topic. It's something that either people were less sensitive of, or just it was a little more taboo to bring up some of the issues of inclusivity in gaming, in broader geek hobbies. And for us, what we're going to be talking about today, specifically tabletop RPG hobby. But it's also nice to see that a lot of the big RPG companies lately have been taking really strong stances pro-inclusivity and just trying to make sure that people are aware that no matter what the stereotype may be, anyone can play a role-playing game.
Yeah. I actually started talking about the inclusivity topic because when I started my blog was the first time I played D&D, and a lot of people, and I was willing to talk about it online and engage with lots of people. Particularly, it happens a lot of guys who were like, well, I would love my girlfriend, daughter, wife, friend to play, female friend to play, and they had no idea how to get in, like how to convince them and stuff like that. So I'd get a lot of questions about that.
And I know, like, something that happened at a convention that I just went to with my wife and my friend Kathy, and we all sat down at a table, and people said their hellos, and one of the first comments that was made was how the female attendance of the convention just went up by like 300% because two women just showed up, and it was an innocent comment. There was no malice meant, but at the
Yeah,
same time, the first thing you're doing is recognizing these are the girls at this convention, and I
right,
don't think a lot of guys understand why that's a problem.
right. Yeah, and it's not always a problem, right? Like sometimes people will notice those things and it doesn't become an issue because you don't start making assumptions based on the fact that somebody is a particular gender. Um, but a lot of times that's not true. Or, um, sorry, that's an interesting one. But yeah, and then also the just the talking about statistics becomes problematic too because there are a lot of there are a decent number of women who play. When I go to conventions, most of my tables have one or two out of five or six, so that's like a decent number already.
And by the way, Tracy, I edit this, so if there's ever anything you say and you want to take back or you want to pause a moment to think about it, don't worry about it. I will wait for you.
Okay, sorry.
No, no problem. I want to make sure that you are processing things at your speed and everybody's comfortable.
Yeah.
One of the things
Uh,
I think helped Tina and Kathy in that case is that they showed up, and we play Pathfinder a lot. We play it on a regular basis, sometimes twice a week, and so immediately they established that they don't need to be treated like the stereotypical girl might need to be treated. That like, oh, we have to handhold you, explain all the rules to them. They immediately showed themselves as some of the people at the table that knew the rules best of
right.
all.
Right. Yeah, that helps a lot. And also, sorry. One of the things that people don't think about when they make that comment is there's this concept in psychology called stereotype threat, and it seems like because they had already played a lot, hopefully they didn't have this happen to them as much. But for some people, what happens is they start thinking about the fact that a lot of people believe that women or girls aren't really good at the game, and that will actually, even if they don't want to think about it, their brain will still think about it, and it will hurt their performance. And that's one of the reasons why I try to suggest to people not to make it a big deal.
Yeah, I think I had something kind of the reverse happen in grade school where I brought a report card home and got a C in science. My parents are like, "But you love science." And I never actually had any feelings about science, but as soon as I was told that people think of me as someone who loves science, I think I
Right.
started doing really well in science.
Yeah, well, that helps too. I think that's like the setting of the expectations. They found that in schools, if you expected your students to do well, they tended to do better than, particularly than if you expected them to not do as well. Like that whole how you approach that and the assumptions you make actually help can affect the performance of the people around you.
Now, sometimes when I talk to people about just how I behave to be more inclusive, a lot of people seem to think it's work. Like it's actually on them to do something rather than letting other people keep up with them so that they don't have to change at all who they are. So, can you just kind of talk about why you think inclusivity is important and why it does take effort from both sides to make sure that you create the most inclusive environment?
Yeah. And I think right now we could even just address the fact that sometimes talking about these things is a little uncomfortable. We may not even be entirely sure what to say here about the topic because we don't, like, at least I don't want to accidentally offend somebody or not be as inclusive as I could in my language, which is kind of what happened with the D&D sex section in the new rulebook. Um, but yeah, so part of the reason it's important to me to be more inclusive is because I love to play, and it really hurts my experience when I show up to the table and it's assumed that I don't really know anything about the game. I couldn't optimize if my life depended on it, or people want to tell me how what my character should do in a role playing game. It gets kind of tricky. Uh, and then also one of the things I realized by we watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, and that really cemented to me that a lot of the people younger than me have grown up in a different world than even I did, where their stories include uh, people from multiple races and multiple like all genders and things like that. So if we're not including that in the gaming space, it can be a barrier for them, I think.
Let's talk about that article at Wizards of the Coast. Or actually, it's not an article. It is in the. Remind me, the section on gender. Where does it actually come from?
It comes from the basic rules.
Which is the PDF or which is the box?
PDF.
Okay, so the PDF they released a PDF of the basic rules for Dungeons and Dragons, the new edition, and there was a section on gender, and it was actually probably one of the longest sections they've ever written on gender,
Yes.
and it included the idea, basically encouraging people to explore homosexual characters, transgendered characters, asexual characters, playing across gender. But I know that my reaction reading it was like, something felt off about that, and within a couple of weeks of my first reading, or within a couple of days of my first reading it, a lot of blogs started analyzing the language they used, explaining basically that feeling I had. They were intellectualizing it, and your blog was one of them. So what was the controversial language they used, and why do you think it caused such a stir?
Okay, so I saw two main reactions. One was like, why do we even need this in the game? And part of that was in, I think it was either third or 3.5, they had language that said that you could play a male or female character. And that, in some ways, was its own nod to trying to be inclusive, particularly at that time period. But it was also exclusive in that it only said that there were two genders. And while in the US, there tends to be this dividing into two genders that are opposites. Not everyone believes it, but there's a trend for that. That's not universal worldwide, first of all, and second of all, there are a lot of people who don't feel like they fit into that gender binary and feel left out if you do specify that there is a binary. And so that's a common one for people to misstep about, and I know I do it all the time, and I try to remember not to. So that was one of the controversial elements too, is that while they were good about, I thought they were good about going beyond the gender binary. Some of the examples they used were a bit stereotypical, or were they only repeated one story. So there are a lot of people who describe being transgendered as, or a fair number of people who describe being transgendered as being stuck in a body that isn't what, like, doesn't feel right to you, the dysphoria. But there are a lot of other people who move beyond that, and they're like, well, it doesn't matter what bits I have, what plumbing I have. I'm a woman, and my body is a woman's body. So that was like part of the controversy. The using of the word hermaphroditic or hermaphrodite has been kind of used as a slur a lot towards transgender or people and other types like intersex and things like that. So there was a real groaning about that, because it really, what it meant was that it was clear that it wasn't written either for them or by someone who really understood the issues. And I don't know what, if any of that's true, but that was the feeling that people reacted with.
And actually, it's funny because I believe in one of the links in your post. Okay, yeah. So you link to someone who updated the language to be much more inclusive and much more sensitive. And at one point, they do accuse Wizards of the Coast of not Here, I want to find the exact quote. It's okay. It's talking about. Sorry, it's when it talks about people off the binary of gender. It's talking about it in a way that's written by cis people for cis people.
Right.
Then it says edited to add, I am in error here. And some Twitter @handles, and then it says, it was written by a cisgendered male for his transgender daughter, edited by a gay man who has a trans brother. And so even like it's an impression that people have that maybe this is just a cis world, and yet actually by looking a little bit closer, no, it's people aren't as insensitive as it may originally have come off. I think
Right,
people maybe are putting their shields up as soon as they see a couple of insensitive words or out of date terminology
right.
and jump to some conclusions.
Yeah, and it's difficult because yeah, because that's going to be their feeling, and they shouldn't have to research everything to know the the feeling has some validity regardless of the intent or the other facts of the situation, if that makes any sense. Because um, people are still going to feel that way. like they're, I mean, we're a lot of the people who are talking about it are blessed to live in a world where they can easily talk to the people who did this and find out what really happened. But when the random person at the store, like if they put this in any of the hardbacks, picks it up, those people aren't going to have that same luxury, right, of figuring out the deeper story. But it is also a reminder that uh, sometimes we should look into those things, particularly particularly those who can and have the time. And there's a concept called spoons, used a lot in talking about social issues, and that's basically the thought that everybody starts the day off with a certain number of spoons, and the number of spoons you get varies depending on different factors. But as you go through the day and you deal with a bunch of little issues, like if you're or big issues depending. So if you're poor and so you don't have a car, then you have to ride the bus, but the bus is like late or it's crowded. Like all those cost spoons. So at the end of the day, you have fewer spoons to deal with other things.
Why spoons?
I don't I don't know how it started off with spoons, to be honest, but it's a fairly well known post online trying to explain the thing. I mean, you could use coins or anything for some reason, but it is fun to sometimes to say that I'm just out of spoons for the day.
I mean, there's some advantages. I can picture a spoon. A spoon is a concrete thing. If you tell me I have 10 spoons in my hand, I can picture that. It's just such a.
Yeah,
I just can't find the correlation to spoons and having to deal with issues based on your identity and based on the things you identify with.
right. But yeah, no, and there is something too that I do wonder if uh, certain word choices were used to to talk more to an audience that is still probably widely cisgendered. But that also brings up another good point that just talking about somebody as cisgender versus transgender, it's not there's not necessarily a pejorative there, right? Like um, we're not when people do that. Oftentimes they're not trying to say that only say cisgender means that you're horrible or anything like that. It's just if we're gonna call some people transgender, it does make sense to not assume the default to gender is cisgender. And cisgender just means people whose how to put this because there's no concrete definitions to these things. But by and large, it's like the way you feel about yourself, your gender matches your sex.
Yeah, I think that's the most fundamental way of explaining cisgender.
Yeah, because it's complicated. A lot of these
Yes.
things are very complicated.
I do think, though, that overall, even the people that were really nitpicking the word choices and really not overanalyzing, people that were really analyzing Wizards of the Coast words choices, most of them at one point in their analysis said, credit for their good intentions. This is a good step
Yeah,
forward. It could have been better. It wasn't the best step forward, but it's a step. It shows they're thinking the right things, and if we express our concerns loud enough, maybe they'll hear it, and the next step will be an even better step.
yeah, and well, and like for a big part for me was just I think I've gotten at least a dozen reaction blog posts on other people's blogs or on G Plus or something where somebody reacts to what I say and they'll tell me, well, Wizards of the Coast doesn't care, and if you want them to care, then you're gonna have to do like all this market stuff. Like I have to get enough people to buy the things for them to even care at all, and I have to do all the things I've already been doing, like going to Gen Con and having conversations with them. So for me, the one of the biggest wins is just them saying that they care, because now I can point to it.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Mike Merles actually pipe in on your Facebook share about your blog article where someone was saying they were dissing you or they were just trying to take down the whole they were criticizing the need for that kind of language,
Right.
and you were defending it, and Mike Merles stepped in on your Facebook page and just kind of backed you up.
Yeah, it was. I can't remember if it was Mike Merles or Chris Sims, but yeah, no. And I had been. I know I talked to Merles, and that was one uh, of the times that he realized the kind of reaction I get when I talk about these things.
Yeah, I
Uh,
know Mike Merles also did an interview recently, I believe it was for the Escapist blog, where he commented that someone was surprised a Wizard of the Coast employee was allowed on the Queer as a Three-Sided Die panel at Gen Con.
yes.
And he was like, why, because he's a Wizard of the Coast employee, would he not be allowed on a progressive, like, gay rights panel? Like, what was it about the correlation between Wizards of the Coast and the subject matter of the panel that some people said they didn't think would go together?
Right. Yeah, and he talked about that on the Mary Sue too. And there, in my experience, having talked to the D&D with and to the D&D audience for at least 5 years now, there are a lot of there's a fair number of people who are very conservative, and that's okay, except that they assume that the company is also very conservative. And all of my conversations with these guys over the past few years have led me to, by and large, the opposite conclusion, that a lot of them are pretty progressive and they're trying. They just don't always know how, and they don't always know the impact that it can have when they decide to do things like the sex and gender section of the basic rule set.
And I do want to address what you were saying earlier about some people just didn't think it was necessary. Whereas a lot of us as D&D players or former D&D players will point out, like in a video game, and say like, oh, there's hit points, there's armor class. That terminology, those ideas came from Dungeons and Dragons, and we'll be so proud of how influential our game of choice is. But as soon as the company does something specifically to be influential and to take a stance, they're like, well, what does it matter? Who cares? Who's actually going to notice this stuff? It's like everybody matters.
I don't
Everybody notices things about Dungeons and Dragons.
I don't need the rules to tell me that I can play a character that's not of my gender or is homosexual or and it's like, yeah, you don't need the rules, but I do know DMs, for instance, that won't let you cross gender play. If you're male, you have to play a male character, and like whatever your gender presentation is, that's the character type you have to play. I don't even know what they do if you had someone who didn't fit the binary sit at your table. And I also know, like, I played at Kineticon a couple weekends ago, and there was a girl, it was her first time ever playing, and she was, getting to your point about hit points and stuff, she had played video games, and she was excited in a way. Like, she thought it was cool that she saw the video game stuff in the D&D, not because this version of D&D is video game like or anything like that, but that's because that's where the video games got it from originally. All those tropes and stuff came from D&D. So
I'm
that,
glad you brought up GMing. Oh, sorry. Finish your point.
no, that's all.
I'm glad you brought up GMing because this is a GMing episode. And
Right.
one of the reasons I brought you on specifically because of all the commentary I read, most of them focused really just on the gender section and talking about the rights and wrongs of it. But what I really liked about your blog post about it was that you analyzed that, like a lot of other people did, and then you said, so if this is their philosophy going forward, let's look at the sample adventure and see how well they've applied their own philosophy. And it was a really smart, a really like spot-on critique of some of the problems with the presentation of the adventure in that it wasn't inclusive, even though other parts of the D&D basic were really showing that you could be progressive, you could be inclusive, and that's the direction D&D wants to go.
Right, because like the art in the starter set was great. I think for at least for gender inclusivity, I think I thought there were a couple of characters that I wasn't quite sure which gender they were, but people can have different opinions. I haven't read anything about that, and there was also some concern about the racial, like human race, skin color representation. But I thought with gender they did a really good job with the art, but reading the actual adventure was a little different.
We'll get back to art later because I know that was also an element of your blog. But so, what were some of the things about the adventure that were kind of ringing bells or setting off alarms?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones was just if you and I can't. So first, I want to say that I have the caveat that I already put 5 hours into the article. I didn't. I may have missed a name or two, but even if I did, just the overwhelming number of male named characters versus female named characters.
Okay, and why does that matter?
So there, this also feeds into a little bit about the way the Forgotten Realms have always been presented to me, in part by Jeff Greiner, which is that this is a world where there's supposed to be more gender equality. And if you have, I think it was like at least 2 to 1 with the male characters, it was way more than that. Uh, you're not really seeing it then, right? Like, because then there should be as many women who are doing interesting and cool things that the adventurers would care about as there would be men, but that doesn't happen in this because there's just so many more male characters. So it gives this feeling right away that the male characters are the ones that we want to talk about.
All right, and then how are the female characters that are in there represented?
So a lot of them aren't. So there are a few that kind of allow you to become part of the bigger groups, and that's so one of the parts of the adventure is that it introduces you to some of the groups in the Forgotten Realms that do things. I think the Harpers might be one of them, but there's just a bunch of them. I think there's at least 4, and this is actually important as part of the Adventures League play, because when you have, because your character after it goes through the starter set, could potentially go on to the Adventurers League. And at least when I played it at the convention, people were supposed to, in the end, be able to choose which group they align themselves with. If if there aren't as many women providing interesting hooks into that, it also leads to the impression none of these are like 100% people are going to get this impression from it. It's the overall thing at the end that really matters. But again, they're not going to really feel like the women are the people you go to get into these clubs that could provide benefits or whatnot for your character. And a lot of them that they would provide, some of them provided quests, but a lot of them was more like pointing you in the right direction rather than actually providing you a quest or any real substantial reward for having talked to them.
And one of the things I really liked you pointing out was how there were a couple of legendary weapons that are
Yeah,
scattered throughout, but there was also a trend related to the previous owners of all the legendary weapons.
right. So I think there were 4 of them, and the longsword definitely was belonged to a great knight that we know as, as Black Hawk Aldith. I hold out hope that Knight and Aldith are could be a woman, but we're not sure. Uh, Hugh, which is a battle axe, was made by a dwarf smith who feuded with the dryads of the forest, where he cut his firewood. The mace was made for a cleric of Lathander, and the breastplate was created for a human hero of Neverwinter named Tergan.
So we've got somewhat androgynous male, male, male.
Yeah, like all of it's feels pretty male to me, and yeah, and so there's nothing really there that like that could have been a great place to provide backstory and a history, a rich history that includes women. In that, the only women explicitly included, as long as dryads are still only female, would be dryads that the dwarf was trying to commit genocide against. So
So let's take a step back and see how it can apply to a GM who's running a either a home game or running a printed adventure. How could they take this model, or if this is the kind of adventure they would write, what's the first thing they can do to make it a little more inclusive?
yeah, so right away, like if you're gonna have special magic weapons, trying to make sure that their backstory ties to not just men would be good. This also occurs with the statue in the one town, I forget which town it was in, uh, that was also, I believe, male, or pointed towards male. So a lot of that stuff is just like make sure your backstory has strong, important women in it, particularly when you pass on items or stuff like that to your players.
I'm just going to toot my own horn for a second because I had an adventure published by Paizo called The Elven Entanglement, and there are four significant NPCs, two male, two female. One of them is a quest-giving general, made that the female, and one of them is an inquisitor that's been captured and you have to save, made it a male. And that
Nice.
was a deliberate choice, just thinking like, what is an instinct or what is the trope for these characters? And
Right.
part for inclusivity and part to just be a more interesting story, let's switch this up a little.
Yeah. Yeah, that helps a lot. Sometimes just switching the gender, you don't always want to do it because there's also this fear that the only strong women can be basically basically men but with female names. Uh, but yeah, no, like switching it up is good. Random rolling your NPCs can help a lot too, particularly if you're random rolling the gender. That can, because a lot of times, so if we can take a step back for a second, part of gaming is that we're telling stories, and but we're doing it in an interactive manner where people are trying to respond on off the cuff. So we try to provide stories that they'll easily catch on to. Like if I start the story of Rumpelstiltskin, people are going to understand where that's going. Um, and so because a lot of those stories themselves have these gender imbalances and other problematic elements, we just bring them to the table without thinking. So sometimes random rolling dice will help us get past the fact that we don't want to think about these things all the time, or that we may even be blind to it. Because I know I do it. I it's not like I always am great at gender balance in my adventures when I'm running them without pre-planning.
And I'll even admit when I'm running a home game, most of my NPCs will be male because I have better control of my inflection when doing male voices.
Right,
Whereas if I'm doing female voices, I'll tend to just kind of go up an octave or two, and it'll start to feel like all the NPCs have the same voices.
right.
But
I have
in
the
that
same problem.
case, sorry, go ahead.
I have the same problem in reverse.
Which makes sense. So
Yeah,
as long as I'm not just saying like, well, they're talking to the matron of a whorehouse, so I have to use the female voice now. No, as long as if every now and then I'll throw a female character that is not the one of the very narrow, defined, usual stereotypes that you'll see in a fantasy adventure, then even if it's imbalanced, at least the ones that are represented are interesting and dynamic and potentially as interesting as the male characters in the adventure.
right. Yeah, and I think too though talking about the difficulties with voices is important because I know I haven't talked about that particular issue before, I don't think, but having talked about similar ones, a lot of times, particularly men will reply, well, but so many men play versus women, so like we should balance it towards the men playing. But the problem with that is that a lot of these guys also want to get more women to play, and particularly to hopefully to run because I know a lot of guys want more GMs. like a lot of people want more GMs. A lot of times people feel like they're stuck with it as being GM. But if they have an adventure like this and it's all male voices, I can imagine, like, I don't know how much I want to run it
Yeah,
because it'll hurt my throat after a while.
my wife has been running an adventure path for the last over a year, and she she's just tired of playing all these guy NPCs. And not it's a Paizo adventure, and Paizo does especially every adventure path they make an effort to be a little bit more inclusive and to find a way that they were less than inclusive in the last adventure path and improve
Right.
upon it in one of the next ones. But even still, just the amount of NPCs that she had to keep track of and the amount of them that were male, it just tired her out a little bit faster than it would have a male running the same adventure.
Right. Yeah, because when I try to make my voice deeper and like have that gravel to it, it totally hurts my throat. And I know it hurts some guys' throats too, but I have no hope.
One of the things about Dungeons and Dragons and the Forgotten Realms is that, unlike Galarian, it's a much older campaign setting, and it was created in a time where gender equality was not the same. It was not the same issue, and we didn't have the same avenues to discuss it. And so, do we have like a "oh, Thor's a girl now" type issues where if you want to have equality, then suddenly you actually have to change the lore?
So I don't know. It's such a difficult issue because I know so many people love the Forgotten Realms lore the way it is, and I don't think there have been as many examples of characters. Like in comics, it's just because you have different people drawing it, and Marvel at least has the multiverse and stuff like that. You can have different representations without it pulling away from the enjoyment that people have if they enjoy a particular way the characters present it. The other ones aren't necessarily don't have to be canon in their world depending on which comic they're reading. Uh, so I I'm worried about trying to change existing characters in the setting, but at the same time, in the novels, at least, every time they move forward, a fair portion of characters have to die, not all of them. So if they started making efforts with those new characters to ensure that there's a larger representation, that would help too. The other thing, I recently read Sonia by Gail. I think it's Simone.
Gail Simone, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things with that is that Red Sonja is very much known for her chain or scale mail bikini, and that is definitely on, I think, most of the covers, if I recall correctly. But inside the story, I read the first six. She starts out in that, and then her outfits change depending on where she is. She's in the north, so she's wearing fur, and then she comes back down and she's gonna do this epic battle, so she's in real armor for that. And I thought that was a pretty interesting way of dealing with this lore and canon of what people expect while still starting to push it out a little bit.
Yeah, I picked up an issue of that, and that's the only issue of Red Sonja I've ever read, and I read it specifically because Gail Simone was the writer, and it's like that does not compute. What do you mean Gail Simone is writing one of the most misogynistic female characters that's out there? Like how what? And
Right.
yeah, you're right. She's just matter of factly writing a fantasy adventure, and the main character, who is just a super barbarian, happens to be female.
Yeah, yeah, and she also talked about a little bit because when she was younger and she first found Red Sonja, she hated the character because she picked up on all of the misogyny and that really, I think, took away from her ability to see other parts of the character, which I think is also something kind of important in talking about gaming, why this is important. So, but she read it for a while, and she could see that even though there was, with her presentation in particular, there was that bit of she's there for eye candy in the pictures, the story was telling something different about the character. That this is a woman. Are we allowed to swear on this podcast?
We are an all ages podcast.
Okay. So she can uh, you
You can
know,
say ass if you want to say kick ass.
yeah, kick ass. She's kick
Go for
ass.
it.
Okay. So she's like a really kick ass character. She can stand up to any guy. She's, what is it, the Devil of Swords or something like that? Sword Devil?
Cool. I've never heard that,
Cool.
but that sounds awesome.
Yeah, I think it's something like that. So yeah, so the 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 image was almost presenting one story and the story itself was presenting another, and once she started glomming on to that part of it, the rest, the depiction faded into the background, and she could even enjoy the fact that uh, the character was very sexy, which for some women can also be an important thing, because the way society often deals with women, it's like you're not allowed to be that. So it can be empowering sometimes, but what happens a lot of times is that women feel like they don't have control over it. So it becomes disempowering. If I don't know if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. Come on, you
Okay.
knew that made sense.
Yeah, I know. I was just like, I'm trying to think of the right words to say here. But yeah, no. So and that's also why it's so difficult to talk about these things, is because it's complex. Like a woman cosplaying in a skimpy outfit means something different to her often than it does to the person looking at her. And that's why these talking about these things can become really complex. And people have different likes and dislikes. We're all different. We have to be inclusive.
That actually, let's talk about the art then, because that whenever the topic of the chainmail bikinis and skimpy dressed characters comes up, I think about the Pathfinder iconics,
Okay.
and the iconics represent the 11 different base classes from the core rulebook, and then they expanded on them. And you've got the sorcerer who's got basically cleavage from her collarbones to her navel, and
Okay.
also the same thing on the sides. Like she's basically wearing wrapping paper and not a whole lot of it. And so some people can look at that and say like that's an example of the problem. But then if you look at the iconic paladin, she's in full plate. If you look at the iconic cleric, she's in medium armor, but she's covered head to toe. She's got a hijab, and so it's like not every single character has to be what like the paladin or the cleric. You can have someone like the sorcerer as long as not everyone is like the sorcerer, because it's okay for someone to be like have a sexual identity, show off that sexuality, and it's also okay for some people to put on armor because you're going into battle and you don't have magic to protect you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so it does. So one of the things too with the Red Sonja comic was, at the beginning I was like, I'm not getting into this because she's just in her bikini, and like because I had to fight against it too sometimes. But as I read more of it, and she started having the other outfits, and there was actually also the other thing that happened was a bunch of the women in the there was a bunch of women in the background, and they were wearing clothing that was not a chainmail bikini, so that helped a lot too. Because just like you're saying, it's the real problem isn't that there are women, female characters out there that have an obvious sexuality to them. It's that oftentimes it's easy to go through some parts of life and feel like that's the only value that is placed on women, is how they look and not what they can do. So if you have too many women where it's about how they look and what they're showing or not showing, like that sort of thing, then it feels like you're not escaping at regular lives. Where if you can have the diverse representation, then it's easy to say, well, that's one way of being a woman, and here's another way, and here's another way.
It kind of goes back to what you were saying about women, which are just men with ladies' names. That like at one point Hollywood was saying we need more strong female characters, and we got them, but we got strong as in a tough female character, but still one-dimensional. Whereas we were
Right.
looking for strong characters who are female,
Yeah.
like strong of character. And so we didn't just want Trinity in every single movie. We wanted
Right.
complex, interesting people. And yes, and you know what? You can be a weak person and have a strong character, still have an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, because there was definitely, and I think there still sometimes is this trend to having women who don't have any flaws. We can't have anything potentially negative about them because everyone will cry out in misogyny or whatever, but most people don't really want that. What they want are these these interesting, diverse, complex characters to a degree. I mean, obviously, storytelling, you have to cut down on the complexity a little, or else it would feel like you're just talking about someone's day from start to beginning with every detail in it. But you know, we just we we don't want the one type of representation of women. We want that more diversified.
I like to compare Black Widow from the Avengers movie to Black Widow from Captain America the Winter Soldier. Because in the Avengers movie, yeah, technically Black Widow gets the win for the team. But she doesn't really earn the win. She just is there, and she doesn't use any Black Widow-specific ability to get the win. Whereas
Right,
all throughout Winter Soldier, she is being Black Widow. She is showing why Black Widow stands out from the other characters. And you get excited to see Black Widow anytime she's on the screen.
right. Yeah, I haven't seen that one yet, but I can totally
Oh
see
my
that.
God. You have to see. Everyone has to see Captain America the Winter Soldier.
I will.
Okay,
I'm a
sorry.
little behind.
I was shocked and like just in general because Captain America, Falcon, and Black Widow, the main characters of that movie, are all kind of one way or another really boring characters. But when
Right,
given the right script and the right director, it just makes an amazing movie, and it should not have been as good as it was.
right. Yeah, like if I saw the one with Mystique in it recently.
Yes, Days of Future Past.
Yeah, and I mean, I know a little bit that they did. A little bit of it was the way that they did her body paint and costume. That it looked like that maybe she had clothing on, even though she didn't. In some areas, but I didn't mind because there were other women who were doing some cool things. I'm not saying the movie was perfect, but I didn't mind because there were other women there. It wasn't the only woman wasn't Mystique, and even with her, she was. I thought she was doing some interesting things, and there weren't a lot of images. So that's the other thing sometimes with the art, particularly with the belts across the thighs and everything. It it can look a little like the only models, or what is it called, the art when uh, do you know what the word is? um,
Explain the concept, because I'm not sure where you're going.
yeah, so uh, they have like pictures where you can see how to draw different people in different poses.
Okay.
So sometimes it looks like the only model they have are lingerie models, or the only like it's like they actually I saw somebody recently shared a third party Pathfinder uh, like supplement, and it really was a woman, a woman with no clothing on with paint, using Photoshop. They just kind of like painted clothing on her. I was like, come on. The other people at least like draw it out fully and put belts in places that, that nobody really wants a belt for, but yeah,
We're
no.
sorry, we're getting a little long, but there's a couple more points I want to talk about. One of them is sexist plot versus sexist plotting, and I'm going to use the WWE as an example for this
Okay.
because a lot of times you'll get something like there's a character right now named Rusev who is the evil Russian, and he comes in and he talks about how great Vladimir Putin is and just puts down the United States. But the thing is, it's not as much a racist angle as it is an angle about a racist because he's making absurd claims and he's the bad guy.
Right.
Whereas the way they plot the women's division, it's pretty much everyone is either crazy or jealous, and that's it. Those are the only defining characters of the entire women's division.
Right.
And it's especially clear lately because WWE's got a developmental zone called the NXT,
Right.
and that's where new wrestlers go to develop character work and develop plotting and all the different believe it or not the nuances of professional wrestling.
Yeah, yeah,
And
no.
like you watch NXT and it's like the women's division is as interesting as the men's division, and then when those same wrestlers move up to WWE and start wrestling on Raw, suddenly they're bland and their stories are boring, and it's not because of them, it's because the only plots they get are the same boring sexist plots.
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
how that relates to role playing um, is that yes, you can have things that actually do address the idea of sexism or have sexist ideas, but as long as it's more of a conscious effort, like if you're just subconsciously constantly making the same sexist decisions, that's a much bigger problem than using role playing to address sexist issues.
Right. So if you want to use role playing to address sexist issues, I suggest getting consent from players first, be- because they may be trying to use the game to escape from regular life sexism. But yeah, you totally can. And one of the great things, one of the ways we talked about it on G Plus and stuff in the past is that if you want to provide an element where you're addressing that sexism exists, right? Have fun, make sure that there's a way to fight against it rather than it just being this thing that grinds on you. Like having everybody go to the female fighter, I'm like, really? Female fighter? You sure you can lift that sword? How about lifting my sword? Just can be kind of wearing you down. Where if it's like you're in a society where women can't do certain things, but through your example, you're able to subvert that and even maybe turn it around so that women now have equality. Like that's a cool way of for me, that would be a cool way of dealing with sexism in a game setting. But if I'm just supposed to take the abuse over and over again, it's just not as much fun.
And it just becomes pointless in a game where you're supposed to be able to solve most of your problems with some kind of a die roll. If this is something that's just persistent and not going away, what is it doing? What is the point of it in the game?
Right. And there's a TV show called Medium that kind of has this. I think by season 2, I was tired of the point in the episode where they're like, oh, she can talk to dead people and get the clues to figure out what was really going on, and maybe her dreams really do mean something this time. Like, after a season of those things, I don't want to get the incredulous look when she comes to her boss with more information.
The last point on the outline is a big one. If we go long, we go long. So it's accommodating your players' ideas and addressing your players' intolerance. We have someone in the Pathfinder Society, though, in the Montreal Pathfinder Society area, who plays a character that he refuses to identify the gender of, will respond equally to he's or she's, to both gender identifiers, and some players I've seen at the table kind of get confused and frustrated and just kind of want him to commit to one or the other identifier, and meanwhile he won't. And it's an interesting social experiment to see it play out. But at some point, as the GM, I do have to step in and be like, so his character identifies as both, or identifies as neither, or is just really neutral about the whole thing. We're going to move on here, guys.
Right.
But it's interesting to see play out, but it's also something that, especially with the nature of Pathfinder Society, where you never know who's going to be at your table, the
Right.
GM has to be the ultimate advocate of what's going on.
Right. Yeah, that's a big one. I so hmm. So I don't know about that in that particular case. What else you could do other than saying, hey, the character doesn't actually really have a gender, and or may feel that they have all genders, so they'll answer to both. And I think that's about all you can do there. But in bringing up other things that can happen at the table, one of the tools out there is called the X card, and what it is, it's a card. I think that you put it in the middle of the table, and basically, whenever somebody starts saying something that just makes you uncomfortable or could trigger something, you can point to it, and you just have to move on. So one of the examples people have used with this is that somebody at the table was trying to quit smoking, and they were playing a game in which one of the guys is describing his character as really needing a cigarette, and oh, this cigarette is so great, and the guy just had to be like, hey, can we move on, because this is really making me want to have a smoke, and I shouldn't have to, like, I don't want to do that. But you can use that for other things too, including sexism, racism, and all those things. It's a good way, I think, to kind of have, particularly if you're with a group that you don't play with very often, an immediate social contract of how you're going to handle those situations.
I like that. Now let's take it larger. Let's say the GM starts explaining succubus is in the area, and someone is just like, I have no interest in a rape creature, and just immediately goes to it. I mean, that's trying to veto an encounter. So how much power should the X card have? How should a GM handle it in a situation like that?
Yeah, so that can be really difficult. I'm not. I think it. I think what I would hope would happen is that the the GM and the player would quickly talk to explain, like, so the player could explain what their issues are with it, and maybe the way that the GM describes it could be changed a little bit. The player also always has the ability to say, "I'm sitting out this encounter because it makes me uncomfortable." Like, you can't force somebody into a story that they really don't want to be in. At least that's my opinion. Uh, and hopefully, like, if it's a home game, you might have an idea about where your players are at and what's gonna make them uncomfortable.
Sarah, we've gone a little long, so we're going to have to close it there, which is too bad because I am enjoying this conversation. Why don't you tell people some resources you know about that they could check out if they're interested in just getting more insight into inclusivity as a broad topic?
Okay, so there's always my blog. I don't cover everything, but you can get some ideas. Then that's serumdarkmagic.com. And also, there's a group of women who have a website. It's called Gaming as Women, where they talk about their different perspectives. Because I shouldn't be. One thing I do want to make sure people realize is that I'm just a woman. Like, these are just my opinions, and other people are gonna feel differently. We're not a monolith.
Excellent. And you've got a second shout out here? Or sorry, did I
I
blank out?
deleted it.
Oh, you did. Okay, great.
Yeah, because it's not enough about the indie, like, role playing games, so I wasn't sure. Uh,
It's your call.
yeah, I think I'm good with it for now.
Okay, great. So until next time, I'm Ryan Costello Jr. Thank you for joining us, Tracy Hurley. You are always welcome in our private sanctuary.
Thanks.
Is there anything that you wanted to go back? Like, I can cut and paste something in earlier, so if there's anything that you feel you needed to bring up, or if there's a point you wanted to make, we can do that now, and then we can find a place for it in the podcast.
I think I'm okay. I can't think of anything that I know at the beginning. I know I got stronger near the end, but that's fine.
I thought you started fairly strong too.
Okay, cool.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's such a huge topic. It's easy to get lost in all the little details of it.
All right. So all I need to do right now is record the beginning, and then I can let you go, or we can stop the recording.
Okay.
So it'll be pretty straightforward. I'll just introduce myself, introduce the podcast, introduce the topic, and say joining me is, and you can say your name.
Okay.
All right. Great. 3, 2, 1. Whoa! I just blanked on how I start the podcast. Sorry, I've got a couple of podcasts, and each one starts a little bit differently. I think this is just Welcome to the Private Sanctuary podcast. Yeah, okay. Sorry. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Private Sanctuary podcast. I'm Ryan Costello Jr. This is a GMing episode, although I also like to think that this topic is nice. Like, it's applicable to all gamers, and it's really just something that needs to be said often enough. We are talking about inclusivity, specifically how a GM can create an inclusive table. And joining me is a special guest whose blog I'm going to take it a step back. Joining me for this discussion is
Tracy Hurley.
We'll be right back to talk about inclusive gaming right after this. That will not go down in the top 10 best intros I've ever done, I'm afraid.
It's okay. Oh, there's a documentary coming out, GTFO.
Okay.
And it's about some of the sexism in gaming, particularly with video games.
Okay.
That you might like when it comes out. I was part of the Kickstarter, so I got to see it already.
Oh, cool. Okay. Tell me about it.
So I don't know if you heard about I'm blanking on her name right now. There was that fighting games TV show, and there's a
Fighting
they
games.
uh, and the basically they had two teams. There were two women who were participating. One of the teams was headed by a guy, name begins with an A, uh, and he was just making really awful comments to the woman.
Hmm.
And she was saying like, "Hey, this is making me uncomfortable," and he would say things like, "Well, you have to get used to being heckled while you're playing." And he even made a public statement about it after, because she threw the last game so that she could get kicked off, because she was only there because she was contractually obligated.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so this what this documentary does is like that was the impetus for it. Was This was like the first time I think the woman who did the documentary had heard about this level of sexism in parts of gaming, and she interviewed people, but she included tabletop uh, role playing gamers in there too. So Jessica Hammer, I don't know if you know her from G Plus, she's interviewed in it. A bunch of women designers and developers for even video games they talk about their experience. They talk about Fat Ugly or Slutty.com and all of those things.
What is that? Fat, ugly, or slutty? Is that like a hot or not, but meaner?
No, it was started by women who were playing online games like on Xbox, and they post the messages that they get
Oh,
uh,
okay.
from random people. Like they win a game and suddenly they're called like you must be fat and nobody loves you. That's why you have time to play these games.
Yeah. From
And
the impression I get, it's a lot more active misogyny on the video game side of it.
yeah, I mean, most people at the table aren't going to say stuff like that to you. I mean, it can happen, but it's less likely. It's like the video games or just part of forums and stuff like that for
Mm.
tabletop. Because I've definitely had people be like, "Well, women women are meant to have babies, and that should be that way in fantasy world too."
Oh, yeah, all right. Yeah, we didn't talk about that, but the idea that, like, at one point, yes, we had a medieval level of technology, and most of the jobs that needed to be done needed a certain amount of strength, and men tend to be physically stronger. But when you've got magic supporting you, like guys would be working out less, and it would be similar to what we are at now, where technology is alleviating a lot of the need for specifically physically strong workers, and so you can have a lot more gender neutrality in a lot more jobs, and that's basically it. Like magic is to that world what technology is to ours. So there would not need to be an exact duplicate of medieval Europe.
Yeah, well, and even that concept of medieval Europe has issues because most women, like, it wasn't, they farmed. They did a lot, most of the work was farming work, and they did a lot of it themselves too. And also, uh, I know in like the 17th century, they were talking about the mining in Britain, and there were a lot of women and girls who worked there because they were slender and smaller, and so they could get through because the mines back then were not these huge mines we think of now where you can walk through them. They have like that high. You have to sneak your way through, and women and girls were a little easier, a little had an easier time of that. So they would be the ones that helped empty the buckets of dirt and gravel and stuff.
And I've also, oh, I forget how it came up, but I read somewhere talking about in medieval Europe there were black nobles, and like you think of medieval Europe as just completely white bread, but no, that's just kind of how it's been presented in art and television and stuff. But that's because of the television era racism. That actually, of the times, it's more accurate to have a diverse
Yeah.
gender, diverse racial representation.
Have you seen medieval people of color
No.
Tumblr? Oh, I think it's a woman, but I'm not sure. Uh, sh- the person is studies art and has been studying a lot of medieval pieces and noticing a lot of people who are not white. and has been posting them. And part of it too is like there was this whole culling of history that happened particularly around the Victorian age,
Mm-hmm.
where history was recast into the Victorian image. So they would
Huh.
remove things like oh, and also even before that, there was a purging of people of color because when the Moors were kicked out finally, because they wanted to pretend that that never happened.
Okay.
So, so yeah, so there's multiple levels of that. Terry, is it Terry Jones, the Monty
The
Python?
Monty the Python, yeah.
Yeah, he did a whole series on medieval lives. And he also did one on sex and history and talking about Romans had phalluses everywhere. They were everywhere. But when the Victorians wanted to display their like very cultured Roman art finds, they made sure that the phalluses didn't appear. They were put in a special cabinet in the back of the British Library that nobody saw, or a British Museum that nobody saw. So there's this cabinet full of phalluses.
So it's almost like finding your parents' porn collection, but classy.
Yeah, but because that was the version of history, because that was happening around the time that history started becoming a social science, where it's
Mhm.
like, well, this is like the way it was, and now we need proof, and we need other books that we can reference. So if you just start removing it from all those books, everyone believes that that's the way it was before, where that's not true.
Mhm.
So it's a lot of exciting times. And there's also been an article going around, I don't know if you saw it, talking about the time when it was women who had the insatiable sex drive and not men.
Oh no, cool.
I'll send that to you if you want.
Yeah, sure. Sounds awesome.
Yeah. Happy birthday!
Thank you, Tracy.
You're welcome.
Have you read Felicia's Day's commentary on the Black Human Torch controversy?
No, I have. I don't even know about the Black Human Torch
Oh,
controversy.
they're rebooting Fantastic Four, the movie series, and they're replacing Johnny Storm with a black version of Johnny Storm. And some
Oh,
people are talking about how it's not pure to the original source. And Felicia Day is just like, the original comic came out in 1963. Civil rights movement ended in 1968. There's a reason the Fantastic Four is all white. It wasn't storyline reasons. It was that that's all that those people can handle. We're
yeah.
more mature now. We've aged. We can have a mixed racial family and like mixed racial superhero team.
Right. Yeah, well, that was one of the things too. After I read the Red Sonja thing, I looked into the history, and apparently, when she first was introduced in the comic form, she was wearing modest clothing. She wore like a long sleeve shirt
Hmm.
and stuff like that. But some artist had submitted a drawing of her in the now famous male bikini,
Hmm.
and that became the look because it
Yeah.
became instantly popular.
There was the diversity in gaming panel at PaizoCon, and some of the developers were just saying like, you'll send art description to your artist that'll be like, we want this to be a pirate woman, a very practical pirate woman, someone that can really handle herself. And then they get it back, and she's just got like the tied up, and she looks like Daisy Dukes
Yeah.
on a pirate ship, and they're like, no, 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 we said we wanted tough, we wanted like just realistic, and they're like, got it, and it comes back and it's the same picture but with larger breasts, and they're like, no, opposite, you made it worse.
I don't remember what book it was, but Sean Merwin had written an adventure, and he had for 4E, and he had the same issue. There was a scene that was very specifically supposed to be a male that was getting, I think, fed snakes by the lizard people, the cultists,
Hmm.
and somehow it turned into a bound woman getting fed a snake.
Eee.
And we saw it, we're just like, what? Because it was printed, and I was like, okay, guys, come on, seriously, a woman getting fed a snake? No, 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 no.
Yeah.
And he was really sad because he had written it. He wanted it a male, like he didn't want it to be a woman because he knew the connotation of it was.
Yeah, I know some guys that were working at Square Enix, which and they were developing one of the Lara Croft games, one of the Tomb Raider games, and the final fight is just supposed to be a whole bunch of people of both genders tied up and like a drill is going through them or something. Like there's a giant pneumatic drill digging in a cave, and it's going to rip all these people apart. And they designed the male hostages, but when the game was released, it was just a room full of screaming women getting ripped apart by this giant drill. And one of the people I know just quit the company. Like, that is so not cool. Like,
Right.
that is a deliberate change you made. You are ignoring something that you paid to get developed to make some weird hostage situation fantasy, and we
Yeah.
are not cool with that at all.
You've read Money Cook's blog post about the iconic fighter from either 3 or 3.5. He started off, he was supposed to have darker skin, and every version his skin got lighter and lighter and lighter. So they've been
It's
trying for a while. A lot of the guys have been trying for a while.
um yeah, you know what? I haven't read the blog post, but thinking about how he's presented in the 3.5 player's handbook, it could have gone either way. He could have just been a dark skinned white guy or a light skinned black guy. And yeah, there's
So
definitely some pictures where he's clearly a white guy.
is it like Rengar or something? So after that, he keeps getting, they keep doing the art orders so that he's the one that's dying over and over and over again. That was their like way of rebelling.
All right, Tracy, I'm going to let you go. So thanks a
Okay.
lot again. This was